It's my pleasure to introduce at the beginning of this second session Cillian Fashard, who is my close friend and colleague. We co-direct the Mazi Archaeological project together, which you can see a little snapshot of here. Sil got to know John while he was a postdoc here at the Joukowsky Institute, but this is another one of those cases where John is actually responsible for Sil and I meeting and starting to collaborate in the first place, well before Sil was a postdoc at the Joukowsky Institute. He's here to talk today about Pausanias and what he has to say about borders in Greece. Sil.
Thank you, Alex. A few years ago in this very same building, I remember John sharing with me his opinion about festschrifts. Now, I don't remember exactly the verb he used, but it was going along these lines. Now, we all agree that it's unwise to contradict a man who holds a lithic, a plastic knife in his pocket, and some hunting cartridges empty, chained around a Hello Kitty duct tape. But John added the following line that you can read. So I think we really have to congratulate here Tom and Alex for making a true, I would say, Swiss compromise, and by bringing us all here without pissing off the honorandos. Initially, no ancient Greek term exclusively expresses the notion of border, understood as the limits of a polity in space. In other words, the notion was never strictly defined or rigidly fixed. Not that the concept did not exist, as we all know, but the many words used to describe borders never did it explicitly and directly. Now, the most concrete word for expressing the border in Greek is horos, which appears in Linear B tablets from Pylos as a topographical term meaning boundary, or boundary district. In the Iliad, it refers to stones used as boundary markers of cultivated fields. The neutral uron can mean the distance, plowed by mules, or the plow. According to Kazevitz, the word belongs to the agricultural world, indicating the furrow, thus the line that delimits, and by extension, the limit, the boundary, and the border. But other words are found. On this slide, I have cited an incomplete list of words expressing the notion of borders and borderlands in Greek. For your relief, I will not read it, but why so many words? According to Lucien Febvre, this lexical complexity reveals the weight of the notion of borders, its significant variations in languages and cultures, and its evolution in time. On the contrary, a limited set of words for expressing the notion of borders would suggest a consensus that in reality does not exist. Since the ability of each state to exercise sovereignty is highly variable, as shown by Cherry, the ways and methods of defining, marking, and calling them can be fluctuating. In this dense forest of words and concepts used by Greek authors, very little of these authors give us good information. It's quite disappointing. And we can't gather information about the borders and borderlands. But one author stands out, according to me, and that's Pausanias. In his work, horos and methorios are the unique words used to designate political borders and borderlands, with some 60 instances. Now, this might sound modest as a number. In reality, Pausanias uses horos more often than Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Polybius combined. More interestingly, Pausanias is the sole Greek author to describe the personal crossing of borders and borderlands. He's also the only one looking for them in the landscape. Of course, Pausanias' interest for borders has been previously highlighted. However, as it's often the case in Pausanian studies, relevant passages have been cherry-picked instead of thoroughly and systematically analyzed. So for this paper, I established an exhaustive catalog of horoi in Pausanias and classified each entry according to the nature of the border. Today, I will briefly present the mapped evidence and try to answer three related questions. What can we learn from Pausanias about the nature of Greek borders? Were the borders of Greek polis under Roman influence radically different than their classical and Hellenistic predecessors? And third, how can we explain Pausanias' rather unique interest for borders? The evidence. I have mapped 59 different political borders described by Pausanias using the words horos and methorios. Each border entry was mapped in GIS, entered into a database, and analyzed using different criteria. 1, the type of landmark used in the delimitation, border, mountain, river, stele, etc. 2, the nature of the landmark, natural or man-made, anthropic. 3rd, if the borders triggered digression of ethnic, topographical, historical, or mythological character. The result is an interactive map in which you can display the distribution of the evidence according to various criteria I have highlighted. A first remark concerns the distribution of the evidence throughout Achaia, as well as throughout the 10 books of Pausanias. First, 83% of the borders involve the Peloponnese, 15% Attica and Boeotia, 2% Phocis. Among the Peloponnesian borders, 46% of the evidence concern Arcadia only. It is important to underline that Pausanias is not exhaustive in his treatment of borders, as he does not systematically note them whenever he crosses them. However, a tendency curve throughout the 10 books shows a steady rise throughout his work. The curve would be even more pronounced, in red here, if we move the visit of Boeotia right after Attica, as suggested now by different authors. This rising curve suggests an increasing interest in borders, but also an increasingly trained eye, I think, for spotting them, culminating in the Arcadian apotheosis. This does not concern borders exclusively. Book 8, Arcadia, also contains more geographical information, mountains, rivers, compass directions, than the rest of the work. Modern commentators have cynically explained this by the lack of goodies in Arcadia, since Pausanias has very few monuments and statues to describe. In comparison with Olympia or Athens, he describes mountains and rivers to fill in space. This is of course misplaced. I believe that Pausanias has reached a new level of experience in reading the Greek landscape. From student in Attica and Boeotia, he has moved to team leader in the Arcadia Survey Project. And I moved to the character of the borders described by Pausanias. Without being loquacious, Pausanias delimits boundaries by citing landmarks that have been used to divide the land. Therefore, his approach is in many ways similar to the one followed by international referees hired by Greek polis to delimit contested borders in the landscape, a task they accomplish by citing a succession of landmarks. Thanks to Denis Roussel's studies, we have a list of 70 border delimitations recording over 400 landmarks, from rocky peaks to green oak trees, salt marshes, and tile workshops. Of course, the only mark intermediary points and not a continuous line. Nevertheless, these border landmarks give us a picture of the landscape cut across by borders. Therefore, I decided to compare the border landscape known from the inscriptions with the one described by Pausanias. First, it appears that the majority of border landmarks in Pausanias are embodied by natural features, such as rivers and mountains. Only 31% are anthropic. This is in accordance with the epigraphic evidence, where 63% of landmarks used in border delimitations are natural and only 37 are anthropic. More precisely, mountains and streams constitute 36% of overall landmarks in Pausanias compared to 38% in inscriptions. This clearly shows that Greek borders are essentially geographical in nature, mostly embodied by mountains. It is worth reminding here that borders and mountains are expressed by the same word in Greece, horos. The harsh breathing is for the boundary, the smooth one for the mountain. Kazovitz argued that the breathing might be, in fact, a secondary intervention that could result from a need to differentiate borders from mountains more formally. What about the famous border sanctuaries, which have been so much in fashion and which Pausanias is supposed to be so fond of? Scholars repeatedly cite a handful of cool passages to illustrate the crucial role of sanctuaries in the definition of boundaries. Although sanctuaries and small mountain tribes are amongst the best represented border landmarks found in Pausanias, they only represent 16% of the total. In border delimitations, sanctuaries amount to 7%, but they represent 50% of the anthropic landmarks. This is precisely what we find in Pausanias, where half of anthropic landmarks are shrines. Inscribed horoi represents only 2% of total landmarks in Pausanias. In the corpus of border inscriptions, they represent 6%, with only 53 polis horoi attested for the entire Greek world. In other words, horoi are clearly exceptional. As demonstrated by Rousset, polis borders were very rarely marked on the ground. The idea of a border ringed by boundary marks, derived from a few ancient texts and assumptions in modern scholarship, is clearly a wrong one and needs to be corrected. Fortunately, it's not found in Pausanias either. In summary, the nature of borders as described by Pausanias is stunningly close, I think, to the epigraphic record and therefore to the reality of Greek borderlands. Mountains and rivers dominate the border landscape, dotted with a few sanctuaries and including disputed microregions and valleys. I think that his treatment of borders should be added to the numerous cases in which Pausanias just got it right. I believe that this success has almost much to do with his perception of space, as well as his understanding of the physical and cultural landscapes of Greece. However, before moving ahead, we must mark a pause and ask ourselves how on earth was Pausanias able to gather such precise information on borders, given their low visibility? How does he, for example, know that the place called Petrosaka in Arcadia marked the boundaries between Megalopolis and Mantinea? Here I think the answer is a simple one. He learned from his local informants. However, I don't think that the informants were the same respectable local antiquarians, as Jones has called them, who guided and informed Pausanias at sanctuaries and cities. Here, in the mountain passes of the Peloponnese, his most reliable informants were shepherds, woodcutters, charcoal burners, resin gatherers, and local inhabitants. These locals knew the area and were the ablest to show Pausanias where the borders of their polis were, pointing out the rocks, the ridges, and the imaginary political lines connecting them. These men are found in the epigraphic record, more precisely in the framework of border arbitrations in which international judges, ignorant of local topography, have to hire shepherds as guides and witnesses, such as this man called Ladikos from the most obscure locality of Askyris near Gonoi in the lower Olympos. Such testimonies fit well in Pausanias' border narrative and could explain why the latter matches the epigraphic record closely. Pausanias used first-hand information when dealing with limits, first by crossing them himself, then by interrogating the people who knew them best. This seems to be supported by his own observation, shared in Book 2. In no land which has been depopulated is it easy to discover the truth about the borders. Because Greek borders are, in majority, just delimited and not marked on the ground, their survival depends on oral transmission of local knowledge. The shepherds gone, few people in the plains and cities could name the local rocks and peaks and subsequently point out the boundaries of the Kora. This line should be engraved and serve as a warning to scholars who draw lines on topo maps, including myself. Still, this does not tell us why Pausanias asked these guys in the first place. Why was he so interested in knowing where the boundaries were and telling us about them? Pausanias' interest for borders has been acknowledged before, of course, and explained differently. At first, borders seemed to be given a prominent role because of Pausanias' method for describing territories, the famous radial plan, best described by Fraser. When defining a region, Pausanias walks from the border of a given polis to its capital, and again to another border leading to another polis. Borders would then function as literary landmarks, structuring the narrative and often giving Pausanias the occasion to write a digression about the myth and the history of the polis in a typical archaistic manner. The scheme, however, is not systematically followed. What could claim that borders, after all, interest Pausanias for being both stories and sites? When borders are marked by monuments, they would qualify then as theoremata, sites. When borders are marked by monuments, when borders are not visible, Pausanias can still use them as logoi, finding an opportunity to narrate intra-polis border issues and past conflicts and subsequently to dive into polis's historical, military, mythical, or heroic highlights that he cherished so much. In both cases, borders could offer a connection with the mythical and historical logos, which has so much appeal to the contemporary fascination with the past. So should the borders in Pausanias be compared as monuments, sometimes ruined, sometimes invisible, but whose mention can serve as logoi? Following this reasoning, Pausanias' interest for borders would then be similar to the one expressed for deserted cities, collapsed temples, and missing statues, and therefore part of the author's archaizing tendency. After all, at a time when Rome controls Greece, aren't borders between polis an archaistic trait? In other words, Pausanias' interest for irrelevant borders will be a nostalgic reminder of a period that has ceased to exist. This view has been most eloquently defended by Alcock. The polis, whose external affairs were now controlled by Rome, survived in an altered form, stripped of their eleutheria, freedom. Pausanias' interest for borders would be a nostalgic reminder of an old-fashioned political organization. Boundary maintenance played a major role in sustaining the social cohesion of the polis, writes Alcock, but borders were now elusive. So should we consider renewed border disputes in Roman Greece as a futile behavior by childish Greek polis quarreling under the patronizing and cynic eye of Rome? Or Greek polis quarreling about the shade of a donkey, as Dion of Prusa would say? Perhaps here it's useful to transport the debate in a wider chronological and geographical frame. When looking at the chronological distribution of border arbitration, one realizes that Pausanias' time shows a steady rise in the number of border inscriptions. Their number is, of course, lower than in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, but nevertheless higher than in the classical period, a time when civic independence and territorial integrity reach its peak. How do we deal with this factor? Under Roman domination, borders still mark the limits of each polis's territorial space, of its economic surface, and certain aspect of its legal authority. Borders are also important as identity and ethnic markers because they still separate a citizen of Stymphalos from one from Orchomenos. This in turn is essential for taxation, which was based on civic boundaries, including tribal ones, throughout the empire. For example, horror I mentioned in the census return of Petra in the 2nd century AD. Burton showed that the authoritative border delimitations in the province of Roman Empire were a matter of public authority and administration. Therefore, they were necessary for the regulation of inter-community relations and taxations. Boundary disputes are very important because they can be connected with the tax system, fishing rights, revenues, local exemptions, the control of a temple, as in the case of Artemis Limnatis, between Messenia and Sparta, rights of pasturage, local custom duties, and harbor rights. In short, borders were necessary for a durable system of rule throughout the empire. Of the 88 examples of resolution of territorial disputes by provincial governors and other imperial officials recorded by Burton, only 8 concern Achaia. By comparison, Sardinia has 3, Dalmatia 12. So local disputes are part of a wider phenomenon throughout the empire, not a characteristic of nostalgic Greek polis fighting over the shadow of a donkey. In conclusion, I don't think that borders should be viewed as ruins, imaginary monuments. I believe that Pausanias had a pronounced topographical, geographical, and geopolitical interest for borders, and that this interest illustrates the importance of borders in the public organization of Rome and Achaia, something he felt was necessary to report. In his 2001 Pausanias article, John suggested that Pausanias might have been badly in need of a good editor. He concluded by saying that, I cite, "An habitual reader of travel writing, I am glad that there is a more lovely work out there to be read." There is one example here, I think, on the slide. The present paper never intended to change John's judgment as a travel writer, but to bring to his attention, modestly, the fact that Pausanias might very well be the first surveyors of Greek borders and borderlines. Thank you.
Way to skate.
Thank you. I'll go with Max. It is a genuine pleasure to introduce the man who introduced me, I think, to John Cherry, way back in 2000 question mark. Brad Sekadat was a member of the first Cherry Alcock cohort here at the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology. Is now teaching at University of California, Davis, and is here today to talk about, unless he's changed his title, Industrial Landscapes, Spatial Politics and Settlement Change in the Roman East. Please do join me in welcoming Brad Sekadat.
All right, thank you, Tom and Alex, for the invitation. It really is an honor to be welcomed back here to my old stomping grounds and to see so many familiar faces and to talk about updates to my research that many of you might not have heard since my departure 3 years ago. As Tom mentioned, I think John and I started at Brown at the same time, and I think we developed a reasonably good relationship, even though, by many respects, we should be enemies. I went to Michigan State for and John obviously taught at Michigan, and I got my master's from Oxford, and John obviously taught at Cambridge. And yet, things worked out pretty well for me, I think. All right. In his paper, Frogs Round the Pond, John discussed some of the strengths and some limitations of archaeological survey. Among a list of 5 limitations was a comment that survey data had not been particularly useful in determining intrasite variability and intrasite function sometimes. Quite obviously, this is because of the way survey assemblages become plow soil assemblages. It's a sometimes messy process that mixes stuff up in conditions that are also susceptible to movement, slippage, slumping, etc. The kinds of stuff we tend to get from survey, therefore, are not always the best at telling us about highly refined notions of activity on the ground. In the face of these conditions, many archaeologists have taken up the cause of trying to do more with the data they have. In practice, this has taken many forms, including the application of geophysical and geochemical testing alongside survey, as well as an ever-increasing level of intensity. The former is exemplified by survey work in Laconia and also, as we heard earlier today, in the work of Parkinson, and the latter by a host of projects that aim to ramp up site coverage all over the Mediterranean and beyond, including those in Turkey, with which I am most familiar. The Central Lydia Archaeological Survey, of which I have been a member since 2010, applied what we sometimes call hyper-intensive survey to both a set of marble quarries and several known fortified Bronze Age sites, trying to parse out some spatial patterns in short-lived settlements. Although these projects have largely been successful, the refinement of conclusions is still something we grapple with. Reflecting on the influence John has had on me in the development of my own career as a scholar, I've come to realize that in many respects I'm still kind of stuck on that question about function. And when I use function here, I'm not necessarily using it in the older term about a specific static function, but with the recognition that there are a plurality of activities that happen at any given site. The same list that I mentioned at the start, as a matter of fact, was one of the reasons my master's thesis explored small finds from the Sambro River Valley in central Italy, and it surely influenced my decision to grid some occasionally unimpressive marble quarries in the countryside north of Sardis in western Turkey, which comprised much of the material for my doctoral dissertation, completed here 3 years ago. In many respects, when I was preparing this paper, I believed I was preparing something that had actually gone beyond that question, but I think, in fact, I've just changed the scale a little bit. And in writing this talk, instead of small quarries in the countryside, I'm concerned with what large quarries were doing, what their role is in the spatial politics of the Roman Empire in the East. In doing so, I'm still on a different level responding to John's paper, but instead of examining intrasite function, I'll present some thoughts on what large-scale site function or site activities, a plurality of them, can contribute to how we understand settlement change during the first 2 centuries CE. For scholarship on the Roman Empire, the relationship between people and the landscape has never been more critical. New research emphasizes the role of space and spatial practices in establishing new political relationships, a topic right at home in the context of expanding Roman political hegemony throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Identifying how and where the Roman political and economic apparatus intersected with local populations, and in which ways this resulted in any kind of noticeable change, remains hugely significant for understanding how the empire operated at its basic level. Moreover, imperial things such as quarries, mines, and monuments become significant not just as indicators of economic and political change, but as the potential means by which the empire constituted itself in its vast territorial expanse. In essence, I want to further contextualize survey data within a very high-level notion of function, and in particular by looking at imperially owned industrial sites. Since I am far more familiar with this in terms of imperial quarries, I restrict my focus to these. The traditional allure of studying things like marble stems from the material's connection to questions of power, economy, and labor. As such, imperial quarries tend to straddle the divide between economy and political intent. Sources of stone have long indicated the presence of economic growth on the one hand, and conspicuous imperial consumption on the other hand. They traditionally represent the ability to control resources and are thus a symbol of material manifestation of power. Hurt, for example, suggests for the city of Rome itself that the supply of Rome with marbles from different corners of its empire was, in comparison, a costly affair and seemingly not always subjected to an entrepreneurial rationale. The use of marble in the display of imperial wealth and power was the main reason for its extraction. In other words, the emperors had remote quarries worked not for the profit of the treasury, but simply because they had the capability to do so. Now, I take issue with that statement a little bit, as the paper will reveal. For other cities in other places, the local aristocracy was perhaps participating in conspicuous consumption too. Russell and Smith argue just such a thing in noting that most statuary from Aphrodisias and other sites in Asia Minor were produced by local artisans for local patrons using local stone. Russell, in particular, demonstrates the strength of local ties by comparing the ratio of local marble used in Asia Minor versus non-local marbles used. The cost of transportation apparently was prohibitive in the vast majority of cases, resulting in wealthy individuals driving production of goods for local flavors. Underneath this conspicuous consumption, however, and underneath the signs of power and economic prowess, are other social indicators of change that are more subtle in nature and perhaps more meaningful for the communities in marble-rich regions. So my beginning question is, what is happening around the quarries in terms of settlement dynamics within the Roman Empire? Well, frustratingly, the number of intensive survey projects in the vicinity of imperially owned marble quarries is comparatively small. In only a few cases do scholars specifically target them to better understand settlement dynamics. Instead, several projects have targeted the inner workings. I think I'm behind there. The inner workings. Instead, several projects have targeted the inner workings of stone-cutting operations at several large-scale sources of marble. On Euboea, for instance, detailed surveys were conducted on the size of quarries, the kinds of tools used for extraction, and related infrastructure, such as roads, wells, implements for draft animals, surveillance areas, etc., within the surrounding quarry complex. The evidence points to a complex and integrated series of operations and materials connecting the stone sources to the surrounding landscape with the proliferation of infrastructural elements in the Roman period. In the eastern desert of Egypt, we see again signs of change and increased intensity, including newly founded villages, outposts, and roads, all connected to the extractive operations. The same with Simitis in North Africa, at Dokman in Turkey, and to a lesser degree at Teos, where Clayton Fant documented signs of internal coordination, record keeping, and so forth. All indications of interest in the coordination of labor and technical aspects of marble extraction. Now, we do have some survey evidence from areas near major quarries, even though the presence of a major stone source was not the impetus for the placement of a survey in that region. Leaving behind the eastern Mediterranean briefly, an early example comes from the Agrolunensis in northern Italy. Here, survey conducted around the ancient city and in the foothills near the sources of Carrara marble reveal a pattern of probable demographic growth during the late Republic without corresponding increases in agricultural sites. The directors interpret these data as indicative of growth related to alternative forms of economic access. Likewise, on Euboea, the early Roman period saw a continuation, or in some cases, the development of new Roman period sites with the possibility of higher aggregate site numbers in the vicinity of Charistos and Marmarion, which occurred at a time corresponding to a significant increase in stone-cutting operations. At Prokinesis in northwestern Turkey, new settlement structures are indicated, though available maps are poor, and it is not fully understood whether these correspond to habitation, industry, or both. At Dokemeon, the source of the famous Pavanazetto marble, which has a purplish hue, the quarry operations are hard to study due to continued extraction of marble from ancient branches, but a number of settlements do arise in the immediate environment of the upper Tembris Valley that are frequently related to military outposts and other new settlement foundations. The data are even more compelling around the cities of Asia Minor. The countryside surrounding Sardis and Aphrodisias, for example, both reveal major upticks in site numbers during the Roman period, as well as the opening of more than a dozen quarries in each region. Now, lest we think that this is an indication of an overall trend in Roman period land use intensity, it's worth comparing these patterns to those of other surveys in Greece and Turkey. Although I don't have the opportunity to present a comprehensive discussion here, there are clear signs that the growth in site numbers during the Roman period is not universally true. Numerous regions of Greece, for example, yield evidence for nucleation and aggregate site reduction, which differ from Euboean evidence. In Anatolia, the Granicus River Valley near Troy yields the same, as did Project Paphlagonia further east. Roman expansion did not, therefore, mean ubiquitous expansion of settlement intensity in Anatolia, conclusion already well known from Alcock's 1993 book. Interpreting the variation between surveys is not, however, a straightforward endeavor. By this I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that it's as simple as quarries equal growth or industries equal growth, and that non-industrial zones do not. Instead, a complex interplay exists between settlement change, industrial opportunities, and other factors. The fact that cities and quarries tend to go hand in hand shows the reciprocal nature of these things. But the patterns do speak to something more complicated than uniform change in settlement throughout any given region in response to Rome's arrival. Rome's influence was felt unevenly, often through major acts of spatial intervention that reinforced the social and political changes in a given region. Most of the quarries that were imperially owned, for instance, existed prior to the Roman period. Their output, however, expanded significantly. Classic and Hellenistic period stone extraction is best characterized as project by project and on an as-needed basis for monumental construction. But these same quarries were used in the Roman period, often for export. Roman period extraction, therefore, did not appear from nothing, but built on traditions, knowledge, and expertise already present in new territorial acquisitions. The Bacicale quarries, at Dokemeon, for instance, yielded on the order of 500,000 cubic meters of marble during a 90-year period from 90 to 180 CE. That's enough marble to fill this room well over 1,000 times. The marble quarries at Prokinesis on the island of Marmara must also have yielded several 100,000 cubic meters of marble, and other imperial quarries yield similar volumes of stone as well. Another way to conceptualize this is in terms of horizontal coverage. Teos, a source of green marble in western Turkey, was relatively small at a quarter square kilometer, while one branch at Dokemeon was nearly half a square kilometer, and the quarries at Simitis in North Africa, sitting on the fringe of an urban zone, covered more than 1 square kilometer. This increase in the scale of extractive operations is important for understanding economy and trade, but it also signals a change in relations between governing bodies, populations, and the material world. The reality on the ground is that it's quite common for imperial quarries and quarries generally to be located near towns of somewhat prominent size. Dokmean, Proknesis, Teos, Keristos, Styra, Marmarion, Luna, etc. Are all located near towns all have towns in the immediate vicinity of the imperial quarry, often supplying the labor needed for them. Moreover, the quarries are well connected to surrounding regions and to regional emporia via the Roman network of roads, so that the communities that lived near the quarries engaged with tangible cues that indicated a reorientation of social and material relationships, both in the form of quarryscapes themselves and in the form of the infrastructure associated with the movement of stone and other goods. So we have two major developments from a landscape perspective. First, the quarries that became imperial possessions exhibit the intensification of existing stoneworking practices. Second, settlement and social organization in the provinces change in varying ways, including nucleation as a general trend in the east, alongside some indications that industrial regions witnessed increased levels of settlement and land use. This does not strike me as all that surprising because of the potentially positive associations between industrial operations and personal gain. Participation in quarry operations contributed positively towards upward mobility for at least some part of the Roman population. Additionally, laborers were often wage earners, a fact that contradicts prevailing assumptions that stone was extracted by slaves and prisoners exclusively. There were, in short, some benefits to living near industrial operations, which are borne out in the textual evidence and the archaeological data. But what is the link between settlement preference and empire? I seem to have misplaced my final page, which is a little bit distressing. Is it?
Yes, this is it.
All right. Team efforts. Thank you. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Okay. What I suggest is that during the early imperial period, when Rome was attempting to enact political authority in new places, landscape modification played a critical role. Quarries are, in fact, just one of many examples of landscape change, and I don't want to make this just about quarries necessarily. They and other interventions offered a chance for the state's presence to be socially, materially, and spatially understood, and the textual references support this claim. The first is when Suetonius credits the Emperor Vespasian with rejecting inventions that would speed up construction because they would rob his citizens of the chance to earn money and participate in the process of construction. The second is a comment in a letter sent by Pliny, the governor of Bithynia at the time, to the Emperor Trajan. This passage is commonly cited by scholars of the marble trade because it argues for the construction of a new canal connecting Nicomedia to Lake Sophon, explicitly noting that transporting stone by cart is more costly than by sea. Pliny also notes, however, that Trajan has the opportunity to merge a large-scale program of landscape modification that combines utility with magnificence, demonstrating awareness of the political benefits of such a project. So in conclusion, the proliferation of survey projects throughout the Eastern Mediterranean naturally brings with it projects that identify internally significant patterns of settlement density, material consumption, and social interactions with the landscape. This is obviously a very good thing since it emphasizes local responses to change. But I think we can retain some of the individuality of each region while also pointing to emerging trends that bring them into communication with each other. Here, one emerging trend appears to be that industrial sites, cities, harbors, and places marked by monumental change facilitated new economic and social practices in the early Roman Empire. These were, to some extent, reflected in the choice of where to live during this period, which actually corresponds quite well to new scholarship on the Roman economy, which is similarly stuck trying to straddle the divide between local practices and broad-scale trends. Major quarries are one of the features in the landscape that seem to pull activity towards them, just as they distribute their material outwards. To return to my starting point, it does seem that attending to the specific nature of activity, whether we call this function or use a term with less baggage, does refine our understanding of the processes of settlement change in the early Roman Empire. Thank you for your attention.
Yesterday I managed to pretty extensively introduce Peter Van Dommelen when he wasn't actually speaking. So today I'll keep my introduction very, very brief. You all know Peter, of course, as John's colleague here at the Tchaikovsky Institute for Archaeology. Prior to that, as co-editor and still co-editor of the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology. His co-presenter today, Alex Smith, is that rarest of beasts, Van Dommelen Cherry graduate student, who is now teaching at the State University of New York at Brockport. Their title today, it's still their title, is Monumental Engagements, Cultural Interaction and Island Traditions in the West Mediterranean. Please do join me in welcoming a combination of Peter Van Dommelen and Alex Smith.
Thank you, Tom. I've never been described in that way, as being a sort of cross-pollination, I guess, but that's great. I realize, too, that I am currently in the way of everybody eating lunch, so I will keep my introduction short. But I did want to mention that it was when Peter asked me to present with him at this conference here, I was incredibly willing to do it and very, very excited about it because John has been an incredible sort of inspiration for my graduate career. And not only has he given me an irrational fear of egg timers, but he has also given me the sort of courage to pursue what I want to do in academia and pursue where I want to go. And for that, I can't thank you enough. So I will buy you a drink later. But, so the topic for today, we're going to talk about the Western side of things, Western Mediterranean monuments a little bit more. This is not something that is outside John's sort of focus in the past. He has done a lot with the Western Mediterranean islands in terms of first colonization episodes, but also he has focused explicitly on diachronicity, and that's something that we are heavily going to focus on today. So traditionally, conventional focuses have been on island trajectories of human or social evolution, thinking of these islands as laboratories, particularly in prehistory. So today we're going to talk about that sort of weird, icky zone between prehistory and history, which is often tripping us up in the Western Mediterranean. And Peter and I, we have obviously connected. Thank you for giving me a dissertation PhD, I think. But we have a connection in the Western Mediterranean that connects us to the islands themselves, but also to the Mediterranean and some of John's work. So what monuments are we actually talking about here? In Sardinia, the Nuraghe, we're talking about these sort of towers of sorts, but also megalithic tombs, as well as well sanctuaries. But the Nuraghe are seen as essentially Bronze Age monuments, at least built between the 16th and 9th century BCE, and these sanctuaries that we'll talk about are early first millennium BCE. But they're seen as generally Bronze Age monuments in that sense. In the Balearics, we're talking about taliots, and this is a nice, relatively puny taliot actually, but these basically form an anchor, these monuments form an anchor for later settlements, and they generally date from about the 9th to 7th century BCE, once thought to be Bronze Age, now considered to be Iron Age. We're also going to talk a little bit more about taulas, which will come up later in the presentation, but generally these large T-shaped monuments, which you guys will recognize immediately. These are ceremonial monuments that were used or built in the 6th century to basically the 4th, 3rd century BCE, but they were used well into the Roman period as late as the 3rd century CE. There also is the Navetas of the Balearic Islands, which we won't talk about so much today. But very interesting for their use in sort of livestock today, actually. They're very important for that. So these islands, when we talk about the Talias, the Taulas, and the Nuraghe, we're talking about islands that are 500 kilometers apart. And it's hard to compare these, and they've been compared multiple times throughout the history of scholarship of these islands, and sometimes to not the most satisfying end. So what we're trying to do today is compare some of these traditions of monumental architecture, but also to explore to what extent these are island phenomena and what extent they are sort of misassessed or not really quite generally well assessed in the archaeological literature today. So, both the Nuraghe and the Taliats are not just Bronze Age or Iron Age monuments, because they continue to be occupied and used for centuries, and in many cases, millennia later, after their initial construction. The expansion you can see here of Nuraghe Santa Sabina with the Byzantine church is a clear case in point. In Sardinia, this continuity of occupation long been known but never really been explored in any detail. It is nevertheless widespread and takes many forms that mostly have in common that they are underreported. So these things are not really talked about very much. These later occupations of these sites, these use of these monuments. Take, for instance, the most famous Nuraghe, Nuraghe, which you can see up here, of Barumani, which has yielded extensive and very clear evidence of classical period occupation, as demonstrated by the black figure Lekathos you can see up there. In the Balearics, it's really the same. Continuity is taken for granted on many sites. Despite a general, almost unspoken understanding of this continuity, interest in these sites diminishes substantially after the mid-first millennium BCE. If not with indications of Carthaginian trade, then with Roman expansion. These sites are no longer functionally indigenous, entering a stage of obfuscation corresponding to what many regard as the proto-historical period of the islands, on the cusp of colonialization. Suddenly they lose their allure to archaeologists in lieu of Roman or Carthaginian colonial sites. If the site is continued to be studied, it is under the epistemological umbrella of classical cultures in interaction, never as a functioning, persisting, or even thriving indigenous system. And therein a disconnect forms, rendering these indigenous monuments afterward obsolete to the modern scholar. Their diachronic nature or potential for such interpretation fades. The question that we should look into, or what we are going to look into with our paper, is whether this is external, i.e. Punic or Roman colonial occupation and takeover of the islands, and thus Romanization of these indigenous monuments, or is it just continuity of occupation and cultural change? In other words, does any process of Romanization take place, or is this simply a conceptual shift of the present? How does this affect the way we understand the archaeology of these monuments, and of these communities specifically? So, as the case with many of these sites, the devil is in the details. So I'm going to explain a bit of a Balearic case study to you all, and then I'll hand the floor over to Peter. So, as many of you guys know, I love islands, and the Balearic Islands specifically. So, Torre de Galmes is an incredible example of some of these later developments. Basically, this is one of the largest sites on Menorca, and it provides us with a really interesting example of the capacity for indigenous settlement to persist and adapt under what could be constituted as new management, without the conceptual changes one might expect from such a shift. So this is actually a house called Cartayac House on the site, which was built in the 3rd century BCE and occupied into the 2nd century BCE. And this really sits between these muddled colonial shifts, these time periods. It's located on the periphery of the site, relatively speaking, And it sees consistent occupation in this kind of nebulous time zone between the Carthaginian interactions and the Roman takeover of the islands. Essentially, technically speaking, this house was built and occupied within the afterlife of these monuments, at least according to the cultural chronology of the island-based Taliadic culture. If one sees this house in the light of colonial engagements, in terms of shifting worldviews reflected in increasing networks of trade and colonial or cultural influence, one might construe the structure simply as an act of resistance. It's very, very similar to the Tala complexes, which I showed you just a little while ago. But is this all? Does this vantage point belittle the efforts of these indigenous groups? What if they are not at all related to the type of colonialism we recognize today, or at least defined as a conceptual Romanization in the form of economic or cultural shift? What if this house, just like the associated older monuments, is an expression of indigenous culture, and we are not really looking at the afterlife of these monuments at all? We are looking at a diachronic engagement within a not so isolated indigenous landscape. So what you see here is basically a terrible photo that I took a while ago of me holding a Tarraconensis shirt, which I was very excited about. Nobody else was. But this is a Tarraconensis shirt that was found outside of the site of Torre de Galmes. And basically it was found within a field of thousands of these shirts. And these amphorae, these Tarraconensis amphorae, represent Roman influence from Spain in some capacities, in particular just after the Second Punic War. These amphorae carried goods stemming from the Roman world to places around the Western Mediterranean. This picture was taken in 2013 in a field outside the site that was later destroyed by a bed and breakfast, unfortunately. But essentially, it represents a sort of consistent occupation of the site later on. Why it was not included in the site itself really remains a mystery. But these sherds point to a later occupation associated with the site, even with our understanding of local pottery remaining fairly limited in the second half of the first millennium BCE. The presence of thousands of these sherds also points to a potential storage area and significant sustained trade with the Roman world. Again, these remains are contemporary with Cartaillac, the images I just showed you of the house, and many other occupational episodes with structures on the site, including dwellings and the Tala precinct. So why are we not studying it? And I'll give it over to Peter now.
Thank you. Moving on to Sardinia for our second microhistory, to the Nuraghe of Saraki, where it is recently started ongoing excavations at this Nuraghe that are directed by myself on behalf of the Tchaikovsky Institute in collaboration with Alfonso Stiglitz of the Comune di San Vero Milis, where we're systematically trying to understand and to engage with this afterlife of the Nuraghe, or rather the afterlives of them. And so the point there is really a monument is, very simply put, a big thing, and it attracts attention. And in the same way, it has always attracted attention of the archaeologists, and archaeologists have rarely looked beyond the big stones themselves, and that's precisely what we're doing. This is the monument as sort of most Nuraghe are presented, so big stone presences in the fields. And we're excavating not in the monument, not in the Nuraghe, but actually outside it. And as visitors sort of have repeatedly asked us, do you know that the Nuraghe is over there? So the Bronze Age monument, the Nuraghe, is sort of roughly traced here. You see one tower connecting defensive wall and the second tower. And there the orangey line is an extension built to it. Well, it goes quicker than I can speak. An extension that defines a new area to it, an extension that sort of reconfigures the function of that tower with, in the orange circle, a gateway built throughout that defensive tower. And we're talking in a period here that's somewhere 8th, 7th, 6th century BCE or so. The two square rectangular red areas indicate two of several more rooms that were first built in and eventually built over this courtyard, and it eventually also took out, as you can see, one of the towers. That is, the building of these rooms is a process that began in the 4th century BCE, but that continued and culminated in the 2nd century BCE when one of those areas was partially built over the tower. And by that time, we're in the sort of very late Punic period, already under Roman rule. If we zoom in further in one area, this is that sort of extended courtyard area, where we see the cobbled, where we get further insights into the complexity of these spaces, which are not just in the architectural elements, but also and especially of their use. We can see the cobbled courtyard floor with, to the right, a door or a gateway through that later built wall, and is pointed to by the ranging pole that you see there. And the older tower, sort of the originally Bronze Age tower in the background. Architecturally, although it sort of covers various periods, it's still sort of more or less in keeping with Nuragic and late Nuragic building styles. But what is not Nuragic at all are the portable finds from this area. And as is very clearly demonstrated by this Phoenician plate and Phoenician tripod. If we move to the other excavation area, just 50, 60 meters away or so, and take a look at the sort of comprehensive view of the material there, it's clear from the mass, the multitude of pottery, that the picture is even more complicated. The pottery is Phoenician, overwhelmingly so in quantitative terms, and unambiguously so in stylistic and typological terms. But the faunal material, here at the top, is dominated by over 50% cattle and just 20% of sheep-goat, whereas sheep-goat is normally the dominant animal used and consumed in Phoenician Punic context, whereas such a prominence of cattle is typical of Nuragic and late Nuragic contexts. Architectural tradition, therefore, cannot be considered just in isolation, but we have to contextualize it, as I was doing, or as we have been doing in these two quick and micro case studies that we looked at, and need to take into account elements of daily life, as I showed you with the pottery at Saraki. And so that makes us, that reminds us that monuments are not just monuments. In many of these cases, they're also spaces of domestic life, and or public spaces that sort of in a slightly different way are part of people's daily lives. And it is in this way that the case can be made that indigenous monuments, prehistoric monuments and in later periods, can serve as anchoring points for communities later, communities coming from outside. The significance of these monuments is therefore not temporally isolated. Monuments can be inspiring, they can be grounding, they can even be critical identity markers, even if they're not used in the same capacity, as we've seen clearly in the case of Torre de Galmes. And as Emma Blake has noted in her 1998 paper, a monument can be generative of an indigenous identity in later periods, or it can make a connection to the surrounding landscape. But in many cases, the function, the role of these monuments can also be changed, whereas in most of these cases, these monuments in their prehistoric phases begin as domestic spaces, perhaps not ordinary domestic spaces, but certainly spaces that were lived in by people in different ways. They become, their functions and roles become transformed in later periods. And a good example of that is this one. We're looking at the central courtyard, which would have been the central living space of Nuraghe Gianna Maria at Villanova Foru. But in the later periods, we're talking 4th century BCE, this courtyard became the focal point of a whole series of ritual activities, which included sort of large scale burning of animal offerings. But which also included the Demeter style incense burner that you see here on your left. And that incense burner sort of also involves a clear reference to the outside world of the island. Sometimes these are generically classical, as in this case, and whereas the other fragment is another one of the examples of these shrines, this case from Nuraghe of Saraki, but that points directly to the Punic world. As an example, as a fragment of a larger statue of the god Bes. In both of these cases, and in a good deal of other ones as well, we can see that both local and colonial features were being incorporated as part of these transformations. Another case in point is the site of Calamore on Minorca, which is a complex of rock-cut tombs, burial caves really, that date to the 4th, 2nd century BCE. Monuments of a quite different kind that we looked at before. Burial in cave sites is a long-standing tradition on both the Balearic Islands, and it's those practices that clearly continued throughout the 1st millennium BCE. But it's these sites, or better, the practices carried out at these places, that made increasing use of external elements, as we can see here from the columns that were added, sculpted on the Calamore cave entrance, to the Punic libation vessels that were found at Son Marie in Majorca. Even though ritual monumental spaces remained by and large indigenous on the Balearic Islands, both the rituals and the appearances of these spaces increasingly incorporated elements from outside. To conclude, therefore, we turn to another of these burial cave complexes, this one on Minorca, the site of Cap de Forma, that more or less remained in use throughout the 1st millennium BCE. And what these burials here neatly underscore is that monumental places like these, or for that matter, the Nuraghe and the Taliots that we looked at, they serve as both as a witness to change, but also an inspiration of tradition, maintaining and reworking tradition. And the more we dig into the roles and appearances of these monuments after their time of construction and their initial or their initially intended use, the more we discover an increasingly complicated relationship with subsequent communities on the islands. A recurring feature amidst all of this complexity and variability, however, is what I would call an enduring and strong appeal of these monuments, and it in many, if most cases, serves to generate or at least to anchor local identities in subsequent periods. An additional element to wrap up with, to consider here is the role of the sea and the fact we're talking about islands. The sea is never far away, and the burial cases are a good case in point because they are preferentially located on, or in fact located literally inside the coasts. The monuments are in all cases very much typically distinctively local monuments, and they remain so through time, even if their use and their role changes. Their strong appeal, their localness, continue to be recognized and indeed upheld. In other words, those monuments, they never really die, as the foregoing may have made clear. Later communities, and those include incoming people, they build a connection with these monuments, even as they refine them and redefine them and reuse them. And we are therefore not terribly keen to speak or to think of these islands as laboratories that sort of stand in for larger areas, but we would like to prefer and present them and insist in a way that we see them, we look at them as proper social spaces in their own right with distinct identities, and it is these monuments that play the key role in asserting or perhaps embodying or nailing down those local identities on those islands. Thank you very much.